Hey, this is going to be a short bonus lesson on bubbling and capturing. We talked about it a little bit earlier when we have our event handling, that we have an option to do true or false. And this lesson will give you a little bit more of an illustration of how it works. So by default, you don't have to include it anymore. You did have to before, and by default, we'll go to false. And it only really makes a difference when you have two events on the same element. So there might be a case where you've attached an event listener to the parent, but then the children also have events as well. And when you are adding these event listeners, you have the option to capture or bubble. So the difference between capture and bubbling is the event is first captured and handled by the innermost element and then propagated to the outer elements. And capturing is the opposite, where the event is first captured by the outermost element and propagated to the inner element. So what we're going to do in this lesson is show you how you can set this up and how you can explore a little bit more about how it works. So creating an event listener on elements, we're going to create a bunch of divs. These divs are going to be inside each other. And as you can see, 5 is inside of 4, which is inside of 3, which is inside of 2, which is inside of 1. So all these elements are going to be contained within each other, and they're also going to have event listeners. So that's going to have multiple event listeners on the same events. And I'm going to show you how it gets handled using the bubbling and capturing. So the code snippet is this one here, where we've got all of the divs. And as we can see, the divs, one is the main parent. And then the next div is inside, next one inside, 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 and then we close off all the divs. And we've got section ID where we've got some output. So this is where we can track what's happening with the bubbling. We select all of the elements and we loop through. We add event listeners. So we add one capture, one bubble. And that's where we've got the function names. So they can be named anything, of course, because they're just functions. And one is set to true and one is set to false. So that's the big difference here, that true and false. And this will clearly illustrate what the difference is. So let's try this out and open up our editors and create a fresh document. We're going to create all the different divs. So we've got our first div, and within here, we're just going to have a value of 1. Inside of that one, we're going to have another div, and this one will have a value of 2. And then inside of this div, we'll have another div, and this one will have a value of 3. So I'm not sure really the best way to kind of output this in the HTML, but we have another div inside of here, and I know it's kind of getting a little bit tight here on the screen. So we've got 4, and then we have another div, and this one is 5. So let me do a quick cleanup of this so you can see it a little bit better. When we refresh it, all we see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because of course the divs don't have any content in it as of yet. We're also going to create another area that we can create an output. So we can call this one, give this one a section tag so that we don't get it mistaken for the divs. And this is going to be the only section tag, so we don't actually even have to give it an ID. I'm going to just add the JavaScript in page, so right on this index page. We'll just have the JavaScript on the page itself. So selecting the elements is the first thing that we want to do. So we've got our output element, and that should be const output element. And then this is where we're going to select that element. We can use document query selector, and we're going to select it by tag. And we have only one section, so we can select that really easily. The other one, we need to select all of the elements, so just call it els, and documents using query selector all. So we're going to select all of the divs on the page so that we can add all of the event listeners to them. Next, we're going to do a for loop, and looping through letting x or I equals 0, and then looping through while els length is less than I, and we'll increment I by 1. So we have a way out of our loop. And this is where we're going to add all of the event listeners. But before we add event listeners, I want to actually add in some styles to these elements. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll set up a variable. So I'll call it L, and then within here I'll have els. So it looks a little bit cleaner when you do it this way. So now I can just reference the object as L, and we've got style, and then border, so one pick solid red, so that we can distinguish between all the different divs. Also L, It's always good practice to try adding in some styling, and of course I could have done this with CSS, but we do want to focus on JavaScript. So therefore, great way to practice JavaScript. Another style, add in some padding, and this actually should be I, because it's not incrementing, so that's why it's only adding it to the one. So now we have something way more interesting, and we see that we've got the same pattern that we were looking at within the example. We can also set, because this is an object, so we can set values to it. So we can have I plus 1. So that means that each one of these elements is now going to have kind of a hidden value there. We could also call it secret or something like that to make it more interesting. Adding in an event listener. The event that we're listening for is a click. So this is going to be for the capture. So make sure that you set this one to true. And the other one is going to be for the bubble, and calling in the function bubble, and make sure you set this one to false. Otherwise, it won't work. So we've got our event listeners, and next we need to create our functions. So we've got one function called bubble, and then we have another function called capture. And within these functions, we're just going to update the output, and I'll create a function in order to handle the output as well. So function, we can call it output. It'll take in a value of message, and then with that message value, it's going to take the output element that we have on the page and update the inner HTML with whatever content. So just add to that, just a quick short format there. And using a template literal, adding in the value of the variable message, and we can do a line break as well. And of course, then the backtick. So we're ready to add in content into the message. So do a quick refresh, make sure there's no errors. So now we can output to the output function a message, some information. And in this case, we're going to call it capture. And then the contents of what we're capturing is whatever is contained within this V. So that's that value that we're set there. So that's how we're just getting whatever value that's contained within there. We could also take the inner text as well if we wanted to. And actually this one should be bubble and this one is capture. So I just got them back. So I'll update that to be bubble and that one is capture. So let's try this and see what happens. Now whenever I click, you see that when I click on 5, what we're getting for capture, so we get all of the captures run. So starting at 1, so it starts at the outermost element and moves towards the innermost element, whereas the bubble starts at 5 over here and it goes through all the elements ending at 1. So if we click 1, we're only going to see 1 because 1 is, it's also the outer and the inner. So that's why it doesn't really make any difference if you've only got the one event. But if we click number 2, we're going to have 2 different events. So let me refresh that and I'll make this smaller. I have it zoomed in quite a bit. So if I click 2, you're going to see that on the capture, we're starting at 1, 2, and on the bubble, we're doing 2, 1. So that's the way that bubble and capture works. So it does take a little bit of time to get used to it. And it is only really important now if you are adding multiple event listeners to the same element. So go ahead and try this out.